bind our drug in the plasma. So this is specifically talking about plasma protein binding, and specifically about the binding proteins that are most commonly binding our drug. So here are the 3 most common binding proteins in the plasma. Albumin, albumin, alpha-1 acid glycoprotein, which is symbolized by the letters AAG. You probably figured out why we do that. Alpha-1 acid glycoprotein is quite a mouthful, but I recommend you saying it around the house now so that your parents realize you're learning and you've got some new words. And then finally, lipoproteins. So albumin, I'm sure you've heard of in A&P, or maybe, in anatomy and physiology. What you can see here, remember I told you the average molecular weight of a drug is 300. And here what you see is albumin is 70,000. So it's much larger by many magnitudes. Here's the concentration of the plasma of albumin in a normal person, average person, 42 grams per liter. It's synthesized and eliminated in the liver, and its half-life is about 19 days. So there's not going to be big rapid changes in albumin concentrations. Even if you shut all the production of albumin off, it's going to take 5 half-lives to see that come to fruition at least. So you can see that things won't rapidly change with albumin, but they can change over time. And alpha-1 acid glycoprotein is a little smaller, 40,000 molecular weight. And here what you can see is that it's in much less concentration. But this is actually maybe a little bit is a little low. There's actually an up to 8 to 10 time increase in the amount of AAG available at times. So there can be great increases in the amount of AAG available. So this changes. Now, AAG is interesting because it's actually an acute phase reactant. We'll talk about that a little bit in a little more detail in a minute. So it can go from normal levels of about 0.7 grams per liter all the way up to more like 5 or 6, even 7 grams per liter. It can increase quite a lot. It also is synthesized and eliminated in the liver, so you can see changes in all of these when there's liver disease. The half-life is much shorter in AAG when compared with albumin, so you're going to see more rapid changes. But it's still 5.5 days, so 20 days till you see things settle out. And I did that by 5 times 5, right? It's actually 25, right? So lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are the cholesterol proteins. So if you have a patient that either has hypercholesterolemia or if they're taking anti-cholesterol drugs, you could see changes in the lipoproteins. These are very big molecules, 200 to 10,000 times 3. So add 3 zeros here. So again, 200,000 to, what is this, 10 million is the molecular weight. So these are very large. And there's several types. Here's your very low density lipoproteins, your high density lipoproteins, and your low density lipoproteins. The LDL is the one that we measure most commonly to look for bad cholesterol. HDL is the good cholesterol, and very low density lipoproteins, this is a mistake, sorry about that, also are kind of associated with triglycerides. But anyway, these can change when you give meds or with people that have cholesterol issues. And the half-life here is about 6 days as well. So drugs can be bound to any or all of these plasma proteins. These are the plasma proteins. So albumin is the most common binding protein. It binds primarily drugs that are acids, although it can do either, but primarily acid drugs. It also can bind bilirubin and cortisol, which are endogenous substances, obviously. The capacity is relatively large. Remember, it had 42 grams per liter, so it's got a large capacity. But there can be love triangles for albumin, and there are love triangles. So it depends upon the affinity, depends upon the KD. Remember, the KD is the concentration where half of the drug, or half of the protein sites are available, and half of them are taken up. Obviously, the lower the KD, the higher the affinity. So if you have two drugs that are competing for that binding site, that albumin binding site, whichever drug has a lower KD will be the preferred drug. There also can be changes in the capacity, so I should go back to that. You can have disease states, aging, renal failure, that will decrease the amount of albumin available. It also is highly correlated with nutrition, so if a patient is poorly nourished, you can see decreases in albumin. Also, in renal failure, there can actually be a change in the actual physical site that binds drugs. So you'll see changes in affinity due to renal failure. There also can be concentration-dependent binding in the therapeutic range. Now, getting back, I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but I guess I will. Concentration-dependent binding means that the amount of, or the fraction of drug that's going to be bound is dependent upon the concentration. This is where you get to when you're actually at a capacity limited binding situation. So, for example, if the drug is very highly bound to albumin, what you can do is overwhelm that albumin system, and as you add more concentration, there's the fraction unbound goes up because you can't bind any more drug. The sites are all saturated. So what you see is as the concentration increases, your fraction unbound increases. So it's called concentration dependent binding or nonlinear binding. And this can happen in the therapeutic range with drugs like valproic acid, which is a anti-seizure medication. It's also used for other neurologic diseases. Salicylates like aspirin, nonsteroidals, you guys know those. Thiopental, which is a drug used for anesthesia and also pain relief in some cases. But you can see concentration-dependent binding. So as your concentration goes up, your fraction unbound is going up. So as your concentration is going up, you're actually having a higher, and it's going to be a logarithmic increase because you're not only increasing your concentration, but you're increasing the free fraction, which is, remember, the active component of the drug. So that can be quite dangerous. All right, so we talked about albumin, which is the most common large capacity drug. There can be love triangles or competition for those sites. Then we also have AAG, which is alpha-1 acylglycoprotein, but I haven't written that down here. I need to write that down so you have it. It binds both bases and neutrals, neutral drugs. There are 4 polymorphic forms. I don't think you need to worry about that. The interesting thing about AAG is that it is an acute phase reactant. What's an acute phase reactant? Well, it's one of the things that's released in the body when your body is under stress or in some kind of trouble. So your body, like we've talked about so many times, is amazingly designed or evolved, however you want to view it. And when there's an injury or inflammation or something going on in the body that causes your acute phase reactants to kick into action, there will be several things released. One of them is AAG. What AAG is a binding protein. So if you, again, were designing the human body and trying to figure out what should we release in times of trouble, isn't it a good idea to release these proteins that will bind up drug or toxins or whatever is poisoning your system possibly and make them inert because you've bound them up. Because remember, bound drug is inactive drug. So I think of the AAG as a bunch of little sponges that get thrown out and sop up whatever toxins or drugs or toxins that are out there to try to help the person survive. But of course, with drug therapy, if we have a patient that undergoes some sort of stressor, like let's say they had a myocardial infarction, and their body's going to throw out all this extra AAG. If you have a drug that's highly bound to AAG, you're going to suddenly have a decrease in your fraction unbound, a decrease in the amount of active drug available to the patient. So we need to be aware of that. The affinity for drugs to AAG is greater than the affinity to albumin. So there's also love triangles with AAG, so you can have displacement reactions when two drugs are vying for the alpha-1 acid glycoprotein binding site. Usually drugs are bound to both AAG and albumin. So if a drug becomes unbound, if a drug loses the love triangle with AAG, it might then be bound by albumin in some cases. So there can be this buffering effect. There's concentration binding, dependent binding in the therapeutic range for both lidocaine, which is a drug used for arrhythmias systemically. It's also used locally as an anesthetic agent. But what we'll be talking about is systemic use. So you can see concentration-dependent binding of with AAG for lidocaine and disopyramide, which is another anti-arrhythmic. Finally, lipoproteins. Lipoproteins is the least